Chapter 1: The Body in the Office. Night was falling over the concrete city, and the lights of the skyscrapers flickered like artificial stars. At the top of the tallest building, the Blackwood Tower, a deadly silence reigned in Raymond Blackwood's luxurious office. The walls were paneled with dark wood, the marble floor reflected the glow of Art Deco lamps, and the custom-made furniture exuded wealth and power. The air was heavy with the scent of expensive cigars and high-quality whiskey. Detective Jack Malone, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much, entered the office. He wore a worn-out overcoat and a fedora that shadowed his scrutinizing gaze. He paused at the door, analyzing the scene before moving forward. Raymond's body was sprawled over his massive mahogany desk, a single bullet lodged in his chest. The expression on Raymond's face was one of pure surprise, as if fate itself had come knocking at his door. Jack took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the task ahead. He approached the body, observing every detail with the attention of a hunter in a dark forest. Something was wrong with the scene. There were no signs of a struggle, nothing out of place except Raymond himself. The window behind the desk was open, letting in a cold breeze that made the curtains sway gently. The detective examined the floor around the body and found a single clue, a small piece of metal that seemed to have been part of a larger object. He called the forensic photographer and started questioning the security guard, who was visibly shaken. The man reported hearing nothing unusual and had found Raymond already dead during his rounds. Jack frowned, skeptical, and asked to see the security camera footage. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The cameras showed Raymond entering the office and then nothing. A black hole of time. While the technicians analyzed the footage, Jack turned his attention to Raymond's desk. Among the scattered papers and the crystal glass still holding a bit of whiskey, he found a half-opened letter handwritten. The handwriting was feminine and nervous. Jack read the first line. "Raymond, I can't go on with this anymore." The letter was abruptly cut off, as if the author had been interrupted. This intrigued Jack. He knew that every detail mattered and that Raymond Blackwood's life, a man enshrouded in mysteries and shady dealings, would surely hide many secrets. With reinforcements arriving, Jack ordered the building to be searched from top to bottom. He needed answers and knew they were hidden there, in the steel and glass heart of that imposing tower. The detective looked once more at Raymond's body. The dead don't speak, but they leave traces, and Jack was an expert at following traces. With one last look at the crime scene, Jack Malone left the office, determined to unravel the mystery that was beginning to unfold. The night was just beginning, and the detective knew that every minute counted. He lit a cigarette, the first of many in this investigation, and muttered to himself, "The truth is out there. We just need to dig deep enough to find it." As the distant sound of sirens echoed through the city, Jack Malone disappeared into the darkness of the corridor, ready to face the secrets that Raymond Blackwood's death would bring to light. Chapter 2: The Mourning Family. The Blackwood Mansion, a fortress of stone and glass, sat on a hill overlooking the city below. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy and tense. Family portraits adorned the walls, solemnly observing those present with judging eyes. In the main living room, the Blackwood family members were gathered, each lost in their own somber thoughts. Detective Jack Malone arrived at the mansion with firm steps, his eyes scanning every corner like a predator on the prowl. He was greeted by the housekeeper, an elderly woman with a rigid posture and watchful eyes, who led him to the room where the family awaited. Margaret Blackwood, the widow, sat in an armchair near the fireplace, dressed in black with a cold and controlled expression. Her eyes, however, were pools of ice, concealing a whirlwind of emotions. Beside her was Victor, the rebellious son, whose aggressive demeanor and defiant look contrasted with his mother's tense calm. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, as if ready to fight the world. Lillian, the controlling and seemingly perfect daughter, stood by the window, looking out with a calculated expression of pain. She appeared the most composed, but Jack knew that often the calmest ones had the most to hide. Harold, Raymond's brother, sat in a dark corner of the room, his gloomy and jealous gaze fixed on the floor. Jack introduced himself briefly and began to speak, his firm voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I'm sorry for your loss. I'm here to find out what happened to Raymond. I'll need to ask you all some questions." Margaret was the first to respond, her voice low and controlled. "Of course, Detective. We are all eager for answers." Jack started with Margaret. She maintained her composure, describing her relationship with Raymond as complicated, but stating that despite their differences, they still loved each other. Jack noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, a small detail that could mean a lot. Victor was next. He was visibly hostile, his voice full of restrained anger. "My father and I never got along. He was a tyrant, always controlling everything and everyone. But I didn't kill him, if that's what you're insinuating." Lillian, in turn, spoke with a rehearsed calm. "I loved my father, Detective. It's true he was strict, but he wanted the best for us. I would do anything to protect him." Harold, the last to be questioned, seemed lost in his own world. His voice was low and bitter. "Raymond was always the favorite. He had everything while I got the leftovers. But killing him? No, not that." As he listened to each of them, Jack made mental notes. There was something odd about each one, a detail that didn't quite fit. He knew one of them was lying. But who? And why? After concluding the interviews, Jack thanked the family and left to analyze what he had learned. On his way back to his car, he turned to take one last look at the Blackwood mansion. The lights were still on, shadows moving behind the curtains. He knew that within that house were dark secrets waiting to be uncovered. As he walked away, a light drizzle began to fall, mingling with the smoke from his cigarette. The night was still young, and Jack Malone was just beginning to unravel the mysteries surrounding Raymond Blackwood's death. With each step, he came closer to the truth, aware that soon the secrets of the Blackwood family would be revealed, and the mask of mourning and sorrow would fall, exposing the true faces of those involved. Chapter 3. The Revealing Will. The morning was overcast as Jack Malone returned to the Blackwood mansion. The fog enveloped the hill like a ghostly veil, and the trees swayed gently in the wind. Inside the mansion, the tension of the previous night had transformed into a palpable unease. The family's lawyer, Arthur Whitmore, a middle-aged man with a rigid posture and piercing gaze, was about to read Raymond Blackwood's will. The family members were gathered in the main living room, each appearing more nervous than the night before. Margaret, still in her morning dress, sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the lawyer. Victor seemed even more agitated, pacing back and forth. Lillian, with a calm demeanor, sat beside her mother, while Harold, with his usual gloomy expression, leaned against one of the walls. Jack stood in a corner of the room, observing everything attentively. He knew that the reading of the will could bring new clues to light and reveal more about the family's relationships. Arthur Whitmore cleared his throat and began reading the document aloud. "I, Raymond Blackwood, being of sound mind, declare this to be my last will and testament. I leave the majority of my fortune and all my assets to—" There was a dramatic pause, and everyone in the room held their breath. "To Evelyn Pierce." The silence that followed was dense and laden with shock. Victor was the first to break it, his voice full of incredulity and anger. "Who the hell is Evelyn Pierce?" Jack saw a spark of recognition in Margaret and Lillian's eyes, but both remained silent. Arthur Whitmore continued, ignoring Victor's outburst. "Evelyn Pierce will receive the majority of Raymond's assets, including the Blackwood mansion and most of his fortune. To my wife, Margaret, I leave a fixed sum of money and our chalet in Aspen. To my son, Victor, I leave my collection of classic cars. To my daughter, Lillian, I leave the shares of Blackwood Industries. And to my brother, Harold, I leave the symbolic amount of $1. Harold let out a bitter laugh, while Victor seemed on the verge of exploding with rage. Lillian, on the other hand, remained calm, though her eyes shone with an intensity that did not escape Jack's notice. Margaret finally broke the silence, her voice cold and controlled. "Who is Evelyn Pierce, and why did Raymond leave everything to her?" Arthur Whitmore looked at Jack, as if expecting him to take the lead. Jack stepped forward, his gaze steady. Evelyn Pierce was Raymond's mistress. From what I've discovered, she was pregnant with Raymond's child, meaning he was protecting his new family with this will. The revelation fell like a bomb in the room. Margaret turned pale, Victor let out a cry of frustration, and Lillian pressed her lips together, her composure finally beginning to crack. Harold simply watched, a bitter smile curling his lips. Jack knew he was closer to the truth, but he also knew that the danger was increasing. The motivations were now clear: money, power, and secrets. He just needed to piece together the final parts of the puzzle. As the family argued furiously, Jack discreetly left the room, heading to the mansion's garden. He needed to think, to organize his thoughts. The fog still hung in the air, creating a fitting backdrop for the dark thoughts surrounding him. "Raymond, you knew exactly what you were doing," Jack murmured to himself. "Now it's up to me to find out who decided you had to die for it." With those words, Jack Malone prepared to delve even deeper into the Blackwood secrets, aware that the truth was closer than ever, but also more dangerous. Chapter 4. The Hidden Mistress. The fine drizzle continued to fall over the city, creating a gentle symphony as the drops hit the asphalt. Jack Malone, now a little closer to the truth, drove silently through the wet streets towards a small apartment in the less glamorous part of town. Evelyn Pierce, Raymond Blackwood's mistress, awaited him there, and Jack knew she held vital information that could unravel the mystery. The building where Evelyn lived was modest but well-kept. Jack climbed the worn wooden stairs to the third floor, where he found Evelyn's door. He knocked softly, and after a few moments, the door opened to reveal a young woman with large, sorrowful eyes. Her brown hair was tied in a messy bun, and she wore a simple dress that highlighted her natural beauty. "Evelyn Pierce?" Jack asked, his voice gentle but firm. "Yes, that's me. You must be Detective Malone," she replied, stepping aside to let him in. Jack entered the small apartment, which was simply but cozily decorated. He could feel the tension in the air and knew Evelyn was scared. He sat on the couch and she took a seat in the armchair opposite him. "Thank you for seeing me, Evelyn. I know this must be difficult for you. I'd like to ask you some questions about Raymond." Evelyn nodded, her eyes welling up with tears. "I loved Raymond. He promised we would be together, that he would leave everything behind for me and our baby. But now he's gone." Jack sensed the sincerity in her voice. He took out his notebook and began jotting down notes. "When was the last time you saw Raymond?" he asked. "It was 3 days ago. He was worried. Said he had something important to resolve, something that could change everything. I tried to get him to tell me more, but he said it was better if I didn't know." Jack frowned. "And you have no idea what it could have been?" Evelyn shook her head. "He mentioned something about his family, about how they would never accept us. I think he was trying to protect our future, to ensure that our baby and I would be safe." Jack realized that Evelyn was genuinely in the dark about many of Raymond's secrets. But there might be something she knew, something Raymond might have let slip. "Evelyn, do you know if Raymond had any specific enemies within the family? Anyone who might want him dead?" She hesitated for a moment before answering. "He always had problems with his brother, Harold. They never got along. And I know his son, Victor, was a constant issue. Raymond said Victor was getting involved in dangerous things, that he was out of control." Jack noted everything carefully. The family tensions were starting to form a clearer picture, but many pieces were still missing. "And what about Margaret and Lillian? What was Raymond's relationship with them like?" he asked. Evelyn sighed. "Margaret knew about us. I don't know how, but she knew. She came here once, warning me to stay away from him. But Raymond said she no longer had control over him. Lillian, she was hard to read. Raymond said she was like him, calculating and determined." As Evelyn spoke, Jack realized that each family member had motives to want Raymond dead. But no motive was as clear as the threat to their legacy and financial control. "Thank you, Evelyn. Your answers have been very helpful. I will do everything I can to find the truth and ensure you and your baby are safe." Jack stood up, and Evelyn accompanied him to the door. "Please, detective, find who did this to Raymond. He didn't deserve to die like this," she said, her eyes filled with sadness and hope. Jack nodded. "I will find the truth, Evelyn, no matter what it takes." As he left the apartment, Jack felt the weight of responsibility grow. The answers were starting to emerge, but he knew the road ahead would be full of dangers and dark revelations. As the drizzle continued to fall, Jack lit another cigarette and walked to his car, determined to follow every lead until the truth came to light. Chapter 5: The Rebellious Son. The roar of engines filled the underground garage, a sanctuary of steel and speed. Jack Malone stood before a row of classic cars, each a testament to Raymond Blackwood's wealth and taste. However, the detective's focus was on Victor, the rebellious son, who was bent over the hood of a 1968 Mustang, his hands greasy and his face marked by anger and frustration. "Victor Blackwood?" Jack called, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. Victor lifted his head, his eyes full of disdain meeting Jack's. "What do you want, detective? Didn't I answer your questions last night?" Jack approached, keeping his tone calm. "Just a few more questions, Victor. I want to understand your relationship with your father better." Victor scoffed, returning his attention to the engine. "Relationship? What relationship? He never saw me as anything but a problem. I was always the black sheep of the family." Jack watched Victor's hands at work, noting the strength and precision in his movements. "I heard you two had a recent argument. Something about you getting involved in dangerous things." Victor stopped working on the engine, his expression hardening. He didn't understand anything, always controlling, always judging. He never gave me a chance to prove who I really am. Jack stepped closer, trying to catch every nuance of Victor's attitude. "What were you trying to prove? What kind of dangerous things did he think you were involved in?" Victor let out a bitter laugh. "He thought I was mixed up with the wrong crowd, that I was getting into dirty business. But he never asked, never wanted to know the truth." Jack crossed his arms, keeping his gaze fixed on Victor. "And what is the truth, Victor? Were you involved in anything that could threaten your family's safety?" Victor slammed the Mustang's hood shut, turning to face Jack. "I was trying to get out of his shadow, build something of my own. Yes, I did some things I'm not proud of, but I would never hurt him. He was my father, despite our differences." Jack could see the pain mixed with anger in Victor's eyes. He knew there was more there, something Victor was hiding, perhaps even from himself. "What do you think of Evelyn Pierce?" Jack asked abruptly, watching Victor's reaction. Victor's eyes narrowed. "The mistress? I don't know what my father saw in her. He was leaving everything to her, you know? That was a slap in the face. But, if you want to know, I don't think she had anything to do with this. She just wanted a better life for herself and the baby." Jack nodded slowly. He needed more information, something to connect the dots. "And your Uncle Harold? Any idea what he might be up to?" Victor shrugged. "Harold was always resentful. He could never achieve what my father did. But I doubt he'd have the guts to do something like this." Jack knew he was far from having all the answers, but each conversation revealed more about the complex web of relationships within the Blackwood family. He needed to keep digging to find more clues. "Thanks, Victor. If you remember anything, please get in touch," Jack said, handing him his card. Victor took the card with a nod, but his eyes were still filled with distrust and anger. "I'll think about it." Jack left the garage, his mind racing. The puzzle pieces were starting to fit together, but there was still much to uncover. The detective lit a cigarette, the familiar aroma calming his nerves as he pondered his next steps. As he walked through the garage, the rain outside turning the world into a gray blur, Jack felt the pressure mounting. The truth was closer, but each revelation brought new dangers and uncertainties. He knew the path to the truth would be dark and winding, but Jack Malone was prepared to face any shadow that rose before him. Chapter 6: The Suspicious Wife. The Blackwood mansion seemed even more imposing under the gray, cloud-laden sky. Jack Malone returned to the property, where Margaret Blackwood awaited in a parlor decorated with classic art and period furniture. The coldness of the environment perfectly reflected the woman he was about to interrogate. Margaret, dressed in immaculate morning attire, sat upright in a chair near the unlit fireplace, her delicate hands holding a cup of tea. "Detective Malone," she greeted, her voice as cold as the marble beneath her feet. "To what do I owe the honor of this visit?" Jack removed his hat and approached, sitting in the chair opposite her. He studied Margaret's face, looking for any cracks in her controlled facade. "Margaret, we need to talk more about Raymond and recent events. You mentioned that you knew about Evelyn Pierce and tried to keep her away. Can you tell me more about that?" Margaret set down her cup with precision, her blue eyes fixed on Jack's. "Raymond was a complex man, detective. He had his weaknesses, and Evelyn was one of them. I knew from the beginning, but I chose to ignore it for the sake of the family. However, when I realized she was pregnant, I knew I had to act." Jack leaned forward slightly. "And how exactly did you act, Margaret?" She sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. "I confronted her. I told her there was no place for her or her child in our family. I offered her money to leave, but Raymond was adamant. He wanted to protect her." "Were you aware of the will?" Jack asked, observing every nuance of her reaction. Margaret maintained her composure, but a shadow crossed her gaze. "I found out after his death. It was a shock, but also a relief to know he had left something for me and our children. Although it wasn't what we expected, Raymond always had a peculiar way of handling things." Jack nodded, sensing he was closing in on something important. "Margaret, I found records of a substantial life insurance policy in Raymond's name, with you as the primary beneficiary. This could be seen as a motive to hasten his death." Margaret raised an eyebrow, her voice a bit colder. "Are you insinuating that I would kill my husband for money, detective? Do you think I am capable of something so vile?" Jack held her gaze. "I need to consider all possibilities, Margaret. Someone had a lot to gain from Raymond's death, and I need to understand all the motivations." She was silent for a moment, her piercing eyes locked onto Jack's. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and intense. "Raymond made many enemies over the years, detective. Not just within the family, but in the business world as well. If you want my opinion, don't look for murderers inside our house. Look among those who wanted to see Raymond fail." Jack mentally noted Margaret's words, but he knew there was still more to uncover. He needed more evidence, more concrete proof. "Thank you for your time, Margaret. If you remember anything that might help, please let me know," Jack said, standing up. Margaret nodded slightly. "Of course, detective. I want the person responsible for this to be found just as much as you do." As Jack left the parlor, he felt the growing pressure. With each conversation, the pieces of the puzzle became more complex, but he was determined to follow every lead to the end. On his way to the car, Jack lit a cigarette, the smoke mixing with the damp, cold air. He knew he was on the right track, but he also knew that the Blackwood secrets were deep and dangerous. With each step, he came closer to the truth, and with each revelation, the danger increased. Jack Malone was prepared to face any threat, because he knew that justice needed to prevail, no matter the cost. Chapter 7: The Envious Brother. The rain had ceased, leaving a wet sheen on the streets as Jack Malone headed to the corner bar, a dark and uninviting place where Harold Blackwood spent much of his time. Jack knew Harold had a complicated history with Raymond and needed to find out if this resentment had motivated something more sinister. The bar was almost empty, with only a few patrons scattered at shadowy tables. Soft music played in the background as Jack approached the counter where Harold sat, a glass of whiskey in front of him. Harold was a middle-aged man with thinning hair and eyes that revealed years of resentment. "Harold Blackwood?" Jack asked, sitting down next to him. Harold glanced over, a bitter smile forming on his lips. "Detective Malone. Finally got around to me. Huh." Jack ordered a coffee from the bartender and turned his attention to Harold. "You know why I'm here, Harold? We need to talk about Raymond." Harold let out a short, humorless laugh. "Of course we do. Raymond, the great Raymond. The man who had everything." Jack observed Harold, looking for signs of guilt or regret. You and Raymond never got along. Why is that? Harold took a sip of his whiskey before responding. Because he was always the favorite. Dad always gave everything to Raymond. Business, fortune, power. I always got the leftovers. No matter how hard I tried, it was never enough. Jack nodded, making mental notes. And that led to a lot of resentment, I imagine. To the point where you wanted to get rid of him. Harold turned to face Jack, his eyes filled with frustration. I hated Raymond for always being number one, but I would never kill my own brother. He was an arrogant bastard, but he was my family. Jack sensed sincerity in Harold's voice, but he knew he needed more. What do you know about Evelyn Pierce and the will? Harold let out a deep sigh, as if tired of carrying the weight of his feelings. I knew about Evelyn. We all did. Raymond wasn't exactly discreet. And the will? One last slap in the face for all of us. Huh? Leaving everything to his mistress and an illegitimate child. It just shows the kind of man he was. Jack was silent for a moment, pondering Harold's words. You mentioned that Raymond had many enemies in business. Can you tell me more about that? Harold nodded, now more interested. Raymond made a lot of enemies over the years. He was ruthless, cutting people off without a second thought. Many businessmen, competitors, even former allies, had reasons to want him dead. Jack knew he was getting valuable information. Can you give me some names? People who hated Raymond enough to want him out of the way. Harold smiled, a dark and joyless smile. There's a long list, detective, but I'd start with Jonathan Pierce. He and Raymond had a big falling out recently. Jonathan felt that Raymond betrayed him in a major deal. Jack noted the name, aware that this new lead could be crucial. Thank you, Harold. I'll look into it. Harold shrugged, turning his attention back to his whiskey. Do what you want, detective. But if you ask me, Raymond made his own bed. It's just a matter of finding out who decided it was time for him to lie in it. Jack left the bar with his mind full of new information and possibilities. The complexity of the case was increasing, but each new piece brought him closer to the truth. He knew that to solve the mystery, he needed to follow every lead and explore every possibility. As he stepped into the cold night, Jack lit a cigarette and walked through the wet streets, determined to find out who was behind Raymond Blackwood's death. The path was still uncertain and fraught with dangers, but Jack Malone would not back down. The truth was out there, waiting to be discovered, and he was prepared to find it. Chapter 8. The Secret Diary. The morning was cold and foggy when Jack Malone arrived at Raymond Blackwood's office. The crime scene had already been cleared, but Jack had permission to search the place again. He had a persistent intuition that there was something more to discover, something everyone else had overlooked. The office was on a high floor of the Blackwood Tower skyscraper, with windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Dark wooden shelves were lined with books and valuable objects, each carefully selected to reflect Raymond's wealth and power. The mahogany desk, where Raymond had been found dead, was impeccably organized. Jack began to rummage through the desk, opening drawers and examining documents. Among the business contracts and personal letters, he found a locked drawer. Using a hairpin, he skillfully picked the lock and discovered a black leather diary hidden at the back of the drawer. He opened the diary and began to read, his hands steady as he turned the yellowed pages. The diary contained detailed notes of Raymond's thoughts and activities, from his most intimate reflections to his coldest business strategies. One entry in particular caught Jack's attention. It was dated a few weeks before Raymond's death. I am surrounded by enemies, both within and outside the family. Harold never got over his envy, and Victor is lost in his own anger. Margaret knows about Evelyn, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to keep the peace. Lillian. She is the only one who understands the weight of being a Blackwood. But even she is starting to question my decisions. Evelyn's baby is my only chance for redemption, my only true legacy. I must protect this future at all costs. Jack frowned as he read. Raymond's words revealed a man pressured from all sides, desperate to protect his legacy. But the next entry was even more disturbing. I received a threat today. An anonymous note saying they know about Evelyn and the baby. They say I can't escape the consequences of my actions. I need to find a way to ensure the safety of Evelyn and the child. I don't trust anyone, not even my own family. A chill ran down Jack's spine. The threat seemed to be the catalyst for Raymond's paranoia. He continued reading, looking for more clues, until he found the final entry, written the day before Raymond's death. I've decided to change my will. Evelyn and the baby will be protected, regardless of what happens to me. I know I'm playing against time. The shadow of death is approaching, and my enemies are closer than ever. I need to be prepared for the worst. Closing the diary, Jack stood in silence, reflecting on the implications of Raymond's words. He knew the will had changed everything, but now he had a clear confirmation that Raymond was aware of the imminent danger. Stowing the diary in his bag, Jack left the office with a renewed sense of urgency. He needed to confront the Blackwood family again, this time armed with Raymond's words. Someone inside that house knew more than they were letting on, and Jack was determined to find out who. Back at the Blackwood mansion, the atmosphere was more tense than ever. Margaret, Victor, Lillian, and Harold were gathered in the living room, each with their own concerns and suspicions. Jack entered with firm steps, his gaze determined. I have new information, he announced, holding up the diary. Raymond was aware of the threats against him and knew the danger was close. This diary confirms it. The eyes of the family members fixed on the diary, and the tension in the room increased. Jack watched each of them, looking for any sign of guilt or fear. Someone here knew about the change in the will and decided Raymond needed to be silenced. The truth is here, and I will find out who is responsible. The room fell silent, the air charged with electricity. Jack knew he was close to the truth, but he also knew the path ahead would be dangerous. He was prepared to face any challenge, determined to bring justice for Raymond Blackwood and protect those he loved. The final battle for the truth was about to begin. Chapter 9: The Shocking Revelation. The afternoon was advancing when Jack Malone found himself back at the Blackwood mansion, the tension in the air as thick as the fog enveloping the property. He had spent the last hour reviewing the entries in Raymond's diary, trying to piece together the puzzle. Now, with the diary in hand, he was ready to confront the family. The Blackwoods were gathered in the living room, each one more restless than the other. Margaret maintained her icy composure, while Victor looked like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Lillian sat beside her mother, her expression calm and controlled, and Harold watched everything with his dark smile. Jack entered the room, his firm gaze scanning each face. I have something important to share with all of you. I found Raymond's diary, and it reveals many things you may not know, or perhaps you know very well. Margaret raised an eyebrow, her voice cold and calculating. And what exactly does this diary reveal, detective? Jack opened the diary and began reading aloud the most significant excerpts, detailing the threats Raymond had received, his concerns about Evelyn and the baby, and the change in the will. As he read, he watched the varied reactions on the Blackwoods' faces. Lillian's controlled surprise, Victor's growing anger, and Harold's disdain. Raymond was trying to protect Evelyn and her baby, Jack continued. He knew the only way to ensure their future was to change his will, and he knew this decision put his own life at risk. Victor finally exploded, rising from his chair. So you're saying someone here killed him because of the will? That's ridiculous. Jack remained calm, turning his attention to Victor. Ridiculous or not, it's the truth. And Raymond's diary also mentions a recent fight with Jonathan Pierce, which may have played a role in this murder. But there's more. Jack took a deep breath before continuing, his voice firm. Raymond mentioned that the only person who truly understood the weight of being a Blackwood was Lillian. And he was right. Lillian, you knew about the will and about Evelyn, didn't you? Lillian kept her gaze fixed on Jack, not flinching. I knew something was going on, but not the details. I was always close to my father, but he didn't share everything with me. Jack shook his head, unconvinced. You're smart, Lillian. Too smart not to figure out what was happening. And you were willing to do anything to protect the family's inheritance. Margaret interrupted, her voice growing colder. Lillian wouldn't do that. She loved her father. Jack turned his attention to Margaret. Which brings me to you, Margaret. You had much to gain from Raymond's death, especially knowing he was willing to leave everything to Evelyn and the baby. Margaret remained silent, her gaze defiant. Jack knew he was close, but he was still missing the final piece. But the real killer is among us and is desperately trying to hide the truth, Jack said, turning to Victor and Harold. Harold smiled, his smile bitter. You think I killed my brother out of envy, detective? I've always been treated as an outcast, but I would never go that far. Jack stepped forward, his voice now filled with conviction. No, Harold, you didn't kill Raymond, but you know who did. And I'm almost certain it was you, Lillian. The room fell silent, all eyes on Lillian, who finally succumbed to the pressure. Her calm expression crumbled, revealing a cold, calculated anger. Yes, it was me, Lillian admitted, her voice full of contempt. I did it to protect our family, to ensure that the Blackwood legacy wouldn't be destroyed by a mistress and an illegitimate child. My father was risking everything, and I couldn't allow that. Margaret looked at Lillian, shock and pain in her eyes. Lillian, how could you? Lillian raised her chin, her voice firm. I did what had to be done, for the sake of the family. Jack felt a mix of relief and sadness. The truth had been revealed, but at a terrible cost. He turned to Lillian. You are under arrest for the murder of Raymond Blackwood. As the sound of police sirens approached, Jack saw Lillian's mask of calm finally disintegrate. Margaret sobbed quietly, and Victor stared at the floor, lost in thought. The truth had been uncovered, and justice would be served, but the Blackwood family would never be the same. Jack Malone knew this was just the beginning of a long and painful healing process for them. But for him, the sense of duty fulfilled was what mattered. With one last look at the Blackwood mansion, Jack headed to his car. The night was coming, and a new day would bring new mysteries. But for now, he was satisfied with a job well done. Chapter 10. The Final Confrontation. The blue and red lights of the police cars illuminated the imposing facade of the Blackwood mansion, creating a somber contrast with the starry night. The heavy silence was broken only by the sound of sirens and the low murmurs of police officers entering and leaving the house. Jack Malone watched everything closely, feeling the tension in the air as he prepared for the final confrontation. Lillian had been taken away by the police, but the story was far from over. Margaret, Victor, and Harold remained in the living room, each lost in their own dark thoughts. Jack knew there were still unanswered questions and secrets to be revealed. He entered the room, his presence commanding the attention of the three. Margaret sat with trembling hands, Victor looked defeated, and Harold maintained his bitter smile. Jack knew the moment was delicate. Margaret, Victor, Harold, Jack began, his voice firm and clear. The truth about Raymond's death has come to light, but there is more to this story than just Lillian's confession. I want you all to know that justice will be served, but we need to fully understand what led to these tragic events. Margaret looked at Jack with tearful eyes. Detective, how did you discover all this? How did you piece everything together? Jack took a deep breath. It was hard and meticulous work. Every clue, every word in Raymond's diary. Each of you played a crucial role in uncovering the truth. But there is still something we need to discuss. He turned to Victor, who looked more vulnerable than ever. Victor, your behavior has been erratic, but I believe you have something important to tell us. Something that can clarify Lillian's motives and the tensions within this family. Victor slowly raised his head, his eyes red and tired. I knew something was wrong. I always knew my father kept secrets. He told me he was worried about Evelyn and the baby's safety. He said he had enemies everywhere, even within the family. Harold let out a bitter laugh. Raymond always had enemies. He created a world where trust was a rare currency. Jack nodded in agreement. And that's why we need to fully understand Lillian's motivations. It's not just about protecting the Blackwood legacy, but also ensuring there are no more hidden secrets that could lead to further tragedies. Margaret finally found her voice, her expression mixing pain and determination. "Detective, what do you suggest? How can we move forward?" Jack looked at her, his gaze full of understanding. "We need complete transparency. Every secret, every fear must be brought to light. Only then can we fully understand what happened and ensure there are no more shadows hanging over this family." He turned to Harold, who still wore his cynical smile. "Harold, you also have a role in this. Your resentment and envy have fueled many of the tensions here. It's time to let that go." Harold sighed, his smile fading. "Maybe you're right, Detective. Maybe it's time to stop living in Raymond's shadow." Jack nodded, feeling that an important step was being taken. "Very well. Let's begin this healing process together. And I will be here to help in any way I can." As the night progressed, Jack continued to talk with the Blackwood family, helping them unearth old secrets and confront their fears. It was a painful process, but necessary. Every word, every revelation helped dispel the shadows that had haunted the mansion for so long. When dawn finally arrived, Jack left the mansion feeling a sense of relief. Justice had been served, and the truth had prevailed. The Blackwood family still had a long way to go, but at least now they could begin that journey with honesty and clarity. Jack stopped by his car, looking one last time at the imposing mansion. He knew his work there was done, but he also knew there would always be new mysteries to solve, new truths to uncover. With a final nod to the officers still present, Jack got into his car and drove away, ready to face the next challenge. The night was cold, but the promise of a new day brought with it the hope that, despite all difficulties, the truth would always find a way to prevail.